Hi, this is Marco Pimentel. Welcome to the podcast, Someone Like You. In this first season, you'll discover founders, creators, entrepreneurs, and business owners who are passionate about creating business models with lasting, sustainable climate solutions.
Our mission and vision is helping every Indigenous person on the planet see and feel their value in the world while we craft sustainable color cosmetics that don't end up in a landfill.
The beauty industry. The global use of beauty products produces over 120 billion units of packaging each year. There's a long list of challenges for beauty brands looking to minimize their environmental impacts of their products. Those include wasteful packaging, water wastage, carbon production, microplastic pollution, product wastage, and animal cruelty. But do customers care about sustainability? In short, yes. Over 90% of CPG categories that were marketed as sustainable options grew faster than conventional counterparts, at a rate 5.6 times faster. So how can a new brand that is focused on sustainability compete with the large multinational brands? What makes today's guest so special is that her sustainability journey embodies the strengths of Western culture and Indigenous wisdom, also known as two-eyed seeing. This concept nurtures the strengths of Western science and Indigenous knowledge for the benefit of living things and our environment. In addition, they honor and practice the seventh generation principle, which is derived by the Iroquois people to not only leave enough for the next generation, but to leave enough for our children in the next 7 generations. And that brings us to this week's episode. Joining me is the award-winning social entrepreneur, Jenn Harper, CEO and founder of Cheekbone Beauty Cosmetics. Cheekbone Beauty is a sustainable and socially conscious brand with a mission to help Indigenous youth see and feel their enormous value in the world while creating sustainable cosmetics. Cheekbone Beauty is known for creating clean, vegan, and sustainable color cosmetics using Indigenous wisdom. The brand uses the concept of life cycle thinking in their brand ethos and in developing products, maintaining a high level of sustainability efforts, transparency, and integrity within the company. In 2020, Cheekbone Beauty launched Sustain, a less waste line of lipsticks with a vision to leave a big impact on the lives of Indigenous youth while leaving less of an impact on our planet. Jenn speaks regularly to university and high school students about social entrepreneurship, empathy, and the history of our Indigenous family. I hope you enjoy this eye-opening and fascinating conversation. Jenn, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
You're an award-winning social entrepreneur, founder of Cheekbone Beauty. I would love to just start. How did this brand come to life, and what was the fuel to kind of fuel the ideation and the start of this business?
Yeah, I don't have, I think, the normal how I became or started as an entrepreneur story. Mine's really rather different. I was in the food industry for most of my career, and at the time of starting Cheekbone, I was still working my full-time job selling seafood as a sales rep for a seafood company based in Toronto. But in January 2015, I had this insane, what I call life-changing dream. All I remember about the dream, woke up middle of the night, pop out of bed. There were these native little girls and they were covered in lip gloss, and all their giggling and their laughter is what sits with me and I remember the most. And they were just laughing so hard because they had made such a mess of themselves. Grabbed my laptop that night and started writing out this idea, create a lip gloss. And I wanted to start a foundation or a scholarship fund in honor of my grandmother. So rewind a little bit. I was at this incredible, I think, intersection of my life where I was learning about my grandparents' experience at residential school. And then I myself had just become recently sober. So November 26, 2014, I get sober. I had battled alcoholism for many years. And I'm newly sober. I have this dream. And it was just so real to me. It was okay, yeah, this is the next thing I'm going to do with my life is going to figure out how to make this lip gloss and start this kind of company that was kind of just coming to the surface in terms of this idea of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship. I had heard of brands like Tom Shoes and was a big fan of like the that whole one for one concept, and then always a huge fan of organizations like Patagonia. And can you build a business that's really about people and planet before profits? And those were the early beginning days. We launched as a direct to consumer brand, which was very common in 2016. At the end of that year, popped up a website and really just started seeing a community grow and fall in love with this brand, and really realized for me that, okay, people want this to exist, but something sort of in the background was happening. We started this very scrappily, if that's a word, like as I had no money, and we had discovered the whole concept of like private white label, and we were able to put products into the world. But I have to be truthful, those early day products was something that I was not super proud of or comfortable with. I was grateful because they were made in Canada, but when I started to ask these partners about ingredients, supply chain, ethical sourcing practices, nobody would give me any answers. And I knew after a tiny bit of research online that there's clearly a huge problem in this industry about how and where raw ingredients were coming from. And I knew I wanted to do something that was more sustainable, and that I knew I could provide my customers when they were asking me questions about raw ingredients, that I could provide them with the correct information, that that our mica is not impacted by child labor, that our coconut oil is sourced responsibly, all of these different things. I just knew I didn't have the money, and so that would have been the next step of building the brand. Like I needed an investor, but that didn't come along for 3 years. I did this on the weekends and at night for 3 years, and working that full-time job before I quit my full-time job and did this 100%.
But when you had this dream, like what you were selling seafood, were you reading about business? Were you kind of exploring this idea that you needed a change, or you wanted to do something? Like, I'm just curious, like, was there something going on in your life that kind of helped that dream come to life? Like, to kind of, fuel that dream, like what was there, or was it really, you were kind of happy with life, and this dream really kind of started it for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So obviously, newly sober, I'm getting a whole different perspective on life and realizing that the career I had would probably not be conducive to me staying sober, in sales, in the restaurant world. And so there was little things like that happening. And when you get clarity, you start to discover, okay, maybe this really isn't what's making me happy. And then something else that I don't think I really had much control of at the time was, I knew from research on the brain, a book written by an author called The Power of Habit by Dr. Charles Duhigg, that my addiction or obsession with alcohol was like this pathway I had created in my brain since I was a young person. And I really would need to create a new pathway. And I think, like, consciously, I knew, okay, let me just focus all my time on something else. And I think building this business could be it. And granted, looking back, I think it's really interesting. I think about my family and friends when I would tell them I'm building a cosmetics company. They must have been like, what is she sold seafood? Like, what is she thinking? What is she doing? But I can tell you, because I was sober and staying sober, nobody said a word. They were all like, yeah, this is awesome. This is great. But I think they were saying that now because they were like, oh, she is literally, this is the first time in life we've seen her stay sober for a long time. Like, let's just leave her be. But I became, if I'm being truthful, my new addiction is building a company, and I became obsessed with Cheekbone Beauty. And it's a lot healthier of an addiction than the latter.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So, often we talk about brand building and you build a brand, and the obvious things come to mind. It's a logo, it's a name, and of course I'm curious how you came up with the name as well. But how did the social side, and you talk about Patagonia and others and Tom's, how did that part create your brand? Because those do layer into a brand in terms of all the different ethos that you end up building. So you have this idea, you are going to start a cosmetics company. How do you, and you wanted to do it with obviously focusing on doing it to build a better company. How did all that play into building out the brand?
Yeah, so as mentioned in the early days, I could not afford to do and build the brand I think that I envisioned in my mind, like where products and packaging were more transparent. What I did know was I needed, and just from my years of working in sales and marketing, I really needed the proof of concept before anyone would, I think, invest. So I knew all of the parts that, like, okay, this is a great idea. It's going to be really expensive. And how's that part going to happen? Well, I had to prove first, and kind of really uncomfortably, but just build this community based on the brand. And the brand was built on this whole idea of empowering and representing Indigenous people, which had not yet existed. There's now more Indigenous brands in the beauty space, but there wasn't when I had started. And the power of social media in 2016-17 was a lot different than it is now. And we really quickly grew this online community that really felt representation had mattered just as much as we did. And that was the narrative I was pushing at the time as a brand, that we were here to represent and bring an Indigenous brand into the beauty space. And that's what we focused on. Instead of, I couldn't worry at the time about, okay, but this isn't sustainable, that's not working. I really knew I just wanted to prove the concept, and the only way I could do that and get somebody ever to invest would obviously to create, growth year over year and show that to a potential or future investor. So the focus in the first 3 years was like representation and how much it matters, and that would be about bringing our cultural ways of, like, visually through imagery and design into the brand, and to show more Indigenous models and do it from that lens. And I feel like that's what really helped us grow the community and build our loyal following that started in the early days. And it was in those 3 years where I realized, my passion for sustainability when I was in my career selling seafood. That was actually a side of the seafood world that I had focused on heavily. Was like, can sustainable seafood exist? Does this exist? Is there land-based aquaculture options that are going to be better for humanity? What options do we have? So that's always been a passion, and I knew that with the brand, that would be a part of it eventually, but I couldn't afford to do that or talk about it, because I believed talking about it in the early days would be wrong when we weren't doing it.
Yeah, you were building the blocks of your brand and the mission, and that would come after. We actually just interviewed Renee from Ecologist, and they've been around. Their name has changed over time, and they've been around for nearly 20 years. And he said the same thing. They were selling the surfing type of T-shirts and hoodies that were made in the exact same way, and it is very similar to kind of how Patagonia was. And they're probably one of the first companies to make their own clothing and fully transition to doing that. But it's taken 20 years. But he felt the same. He felt the same way in the beginning too. Is that they just couldn't do it because they had to do what everybody else was doing in the beginning. And so from there, I'd love to just understand. So you build. You're building the brand. It's starting to take shape. It sounds like it started to connect with people. I'm curious about what was that kind of aha moment for you that this is starting to work and people are starting to engage with this brand?
Yeah, I think it was, just looking at revenue in the first, like, this was like just a side thing for me at night and on the weekends, and seeing that like, I think, 125K first year. And then the second year it was like 350. Like the numbers were kind of for me, I didn't realize that that's how lots of brands were being built at the time, and how this space of building something using social media was truly effective in those days. And I I couldn't believe, actually, personally, that I had a full-time job and this was just like my weekend thing and night thing. And it was growing, and people wanted it. Like people wanted more. And then that's when in 2018 is when I really realized that there was potential for this to be so much more.
And how did so you had that realization, how did you take that next step? And you talked about, not having the funds to be able to do it. Did you end up, grants, family, friends, or did you go to the VC world and do a round of financing?
Yeah. So, it was the timing. And sometimes when I think about being an entrepreneur and building something, it's like timing is everything. And Raven Capital had just launched in 2018. I remember meeting one of their founders at an event, and I was on a panel and spoke to one of their partners, and they said, look, we're trying to build this thing, and we're really wanting to invest in Indigenous social impact businesses. We want to be a social impact fund. And I'm like, okay, great. I had no idea. Like, I kind of knew what it meant, but I didn't know. And we stayed in touch. And then they reached back out just around the end of 2018, after I had my first conversation with Sephora, and learned from that experience that like Sephora would never put like a white private label product on their shelf, because anyone can do that, right? Like, this has to be an incredibly unique product. And as a brand, that's where I saw we were struggling the most. It was like, our product story is not as strong as our brand story, and we needed to make some major improvements there. And we would do that by changing and transforming our products to be more sustainable, using our Indigenous roots as a guide, and leading us through really how we make and create everything, and how we build the company now is all based on my Indigenous roots, and how we would weave that into the storytelling of brand also, and product development. And that was our weakness. And I discovered that. And then I shared with Raven in a meeting in 2019, this vision for a new brand with, feeding off our representation matters, side of things. Like, that foundation would never leave. But our mission and vision, it's only changed slightly, and in terms of products. And this is, our mission and vision is helping every Indigenous person on the planet see and feel their value in the world, while we craft sustainable color cosmetics that don't end up in a landfill. And so that our mission and vision has always been about helping our community see themselves and feel represented. But then we've now added the sustainability portion to it. And I shared with them what we saw and how we could start with like one sort of category at a time, focusing on lips first. And they were in. They believed that this was possible, and that the potential for a brand like ours to exist and partner with organizations like Sephora would work. And so they decided to invest in Cheekbone Beauty in August of 2019. So it took about 8 months for all of our deals to run through. And then for us, fortunately, it was, again, timing. We ended up auditioning for Dragon's Den in May of 2019, and our episode aired just after getting some funding in September. We were on the season premiere of season 14 of Dragon's Den. And I really, people ask about pivotal growth moments in a brand, and Dragon's Den certainly did help with that for that year for us.
Every week on Someone Like You, we dive into stimulating conversations with founders, entrepreneurs, business owners, and the likes who are consciously and successfully creating sustainable business solutions for the long haul. Tune in every week for a new inspiring conversation on leading climate solutions. And if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and a review. So the funding is closed. I love this lifestyle thinking, and obviously it has this Indigenous roots, and I love to kind of just explore that in line with just the beauty industry. So when you think about the beauty industry, I don't typically think sustainability, and so I would love just to understand your thoughts on the beauty industry when it comes to sustainability. And then if we can get into just this life cycle thinking and using your Indigenous roots and on how the lessons that you learned and how you applied those to your business would be absolutely incredible. I'm a big fly fisherman. I love going outdoors, and I'm very familiar with a lot of Indigenous land protectors that help the rivers. And nobody's going to have the knowledge like them. So I'd love to understand how you applied that to your business as well.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I'm really open and transparent. I didn't grow up in community. My family is a very traditional Ojibwe family from northwestern Ontario, but I did grow up here where we're headquartered in St. Catharines with my mom, who's not Indigenous. And so my whole learning about my culture has only happened over the last 8 years, where I've become really reconnected. I was estranged from my father. We had super dysfunctional relationship. But again, in learning about my grandmother's experience at residential school, completely understanding how that impacted my family and many, many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis families to this day. And the healing for me had begun in that 2014 year. And when we talk about, I knew nothing about business, I knew nothing about entrepreneurship. I feel like in those early days, me discovering my addiction also came from a massive identity crisis. And so, years of therapy. And then between that year, 2015, 2016, just before we launched, there was so much like preparation happening. And I read, like 100 books in those 2 years. And all of these books were on building a company, marketing strategy, like any sort of business book or entrepreneurial story journey I could get my hands on, I was reading it. And then at the same time, I was also reading anything and everything possible I could find on Indigenous history and looking for Indigenous authors and stories and reading those. And then now this reconnection with my family and understanding like how it was all like intertwined, and it was in those discoveries and that I really realized, wow, there is so much power in our communities in terms of Indigenous teachings and learning. I mean, just the 7 generations teaching alone, thinking about, imagine all humans, we really and collectively thought and acted in this way, that if we think today, what our actions and what we do will impact the next 7 generations, not only from an environmental perspective, but maybe from a mental and emotional standpoint as well, like what that means for our families and communities and our planet. And that's just one. And so the more I dove in, learning about the 7 grandfather teachings, which are from my Anishinaabe roots, from my Ojibwe roots, like these are just like values and principles that really guide someone's way of living in life, and understanding that my family and my father in particular, like over these years, really understanding his connection and seeing it live out before my eyes with his relationship with all things living. Like it's something like I've never seen or experienced until I've been in community and watched how Indigenous people have this just innate connection to like land, anything from the natural world. It feels like family. And you hear our community say things like all my relations, like they're not kidding. Like these are things that are I think ingrained in a lot of our communities and our systems. And so from this business standpoint, I always looked at this very skeptical, because is it possible? And to be honest, I still say that to this day. We're a CPG business entering an industry that is like notoriously been harmful in terms of like, I think it's 120 billion units of packaging end up in the landfill every single year from the beauty industry. And so Is it possible? Well, that's what a brand, when you have like pie in the sky kind of goals, like, is it possible that we could bring a new way of thinking in terms of product development and how you build a company into the beauty industry? Yet to be determined, because we're still here trying to see, and we're so small in the grand scheme of things, of the kinds of organizations that exist in the beauty space. But I think, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I'm like, well, what do I have to lose? And it's worth a shot, that to see if the beauty space in the beauty world in general can stop and maybe take pause and think more deeply about the kind of products they're purchasing and putting in their homes and on their skin and putting into the world in landfills, right? Potentially. So is it possible to purchase products from a brand that's trying to do something differently?
And when you start to break down that process of building out these products and to focus around something that is sustainable, packaging, ingredients, life cycle thinking, what were the pieces that, and what are the pieces that kind of make up Cheekbone Beauty products today as you work towards a more sustainable future? And of course, things take time, and I think now, unfortunately, the pressure of time is hard, because we, you hear about that we don't have a lot of time in terms of, our planet and what's happening. But where did you start, and what were the things that you started to focus on, and what today are you working on in order to start to try to get to as obviously zero waste as possible?
Yeah, so we took this idea of life cycle thinking, which is a Western concept that was built out at the University of Portugal. And then we marry this with an Indigenous teaching called Two-Eyed Seeing, which was created on the east coast of Canada by Dr. Albert Marshall, where we're taking two worldviews and combining them in terms of product development. So with life cycle thinking, you think of building something out from the harvesting stage, so the harvesting of raw ingredients, which those raw ingredients then pertain to not only the product, but then also the packaging, and going to the end of the life of the product. And when we think of end of the life of the product, I think so for so long, that's where we've stopped. And if we think about that, and that's what we do as a brand, like, we don't want our products or the packaging to impact an ecosystem negatively or end up in a landfill. And so how do we work backwards to prevent that from happening? And then it's about breaking down, the packaging pieces, the raw ingredients that go into our formulations. Are they naturally derived? Will they biodegrade in ecosystems? If someone's wearing our lipstick and is in a lake, is that lipstick going to impact that waterway or water system or aquatic life in that area because of an ingredient that's in our products? And so what we've done is, in our formulations, removed ingredients that would do that, and then we think about our packaging that way as well. As like, how, we know virgin plastic, there's ways to eliminate it, and we always are so clear and transparent about the fact that, like you've mentioned, this is a long game. This is a journey, and it's costly because of the time factor, and then costly because of the work. But we've really come to the conclusion that there is no black and white answer when it comes to the kinds of formulations or the kinds of packaging, that everything is like a case by case or product by product in our case scenario. In some cases, aluminum will work best in this situation. In another case, it's wood, paper, or all of those things. So we have to look at each product individually and each formulation individually to make those decisions. But using that concept of life cycle thinking and life cycle analysis is how we come to those conclusions. And then along the way, like, to be perfectly honest, we'll be shifting into a new type of packaging when we relaunch in some more stores in Sephora in Canada. We're working on a refillable option. And then, we think about this and we're like, okay, we're trying it. Is this going to work? Does the customer want to pay? Right? Like, these are serious questions that we're trying to answer and bring our community and get them involved. You know, does a refillable option, is it better? Will someone use that and refill it? Like, so there's a lot of what ifs, because if you've never done it before and don't have any data, then you have nothing to work from, so you have to try it.
And you've donated over $150,000 to different charities. We're talking about, trying packaging that, you've never tried before. Is it going to work? You think about this life cycle thinking, the social aspect of everything that you're building. All of this sounds incredibly difficult comparatively to what is kind of the status quo, plus the fact that you're a new brand, plus the fact that you're going against conglomerates that are absolutely massive. So how do you think about the future, and like what's next for Cheekbone Beauty as you kind of continue to not only grow but create impact?
I love this question. Had the most challenging year, both from a business perspective and a professional and personal perspective last year, and even starting 2023 doesn't feel like it's starting off much better. And I was reminded by my team and, on a really important call, because what I love about working with Raven Impact is they measure the social impact part of their investment. And so we have literally 2-3 hour long calls, meetings over certain periods of time, so that we can really, hone in on the kind of impact that we're making. And we're just one of their businesses. They have several, but in terms of the kind of impact that we're making. And so our scholarship fund last year, in 2021, was $2,500. And despite having a not a great revenue year in terms of growth, 2022, our scholarship fund is going to be $22,000 this year. So that to me is just dramatic growth in terms of our giving back. And if I look and remember and think and take time, because I forget to do that, sometimes I'm just beating myself up because I'm come from a sales background, and it's horrible because all you do is look at numbers and revenue and think you're losing if it's not up, right? Like you feel like you're just losing completely. But then I saw this and I'm like, no, this is why I started the brand. The world didn't need another beauty brand, but it did need one that was paying attention to Indigenous people and supporting them. And that's what we get to do. And we get to do it at an even greater level this year, despite having a crappy revenue year.
And I'm sure that you mentioned Patagonia, and I've read lots of books on Yvon and his books as well. And I think if you focus on all the pieces, you can have these ups and downs in terms of revenue and business. But I think ultimately all of that will pay you back in ways that at some point in life and in some point in this business you'll see. So, in your own words, like, when we think about impact in terms of on our planet Earth and your brand, what type of impact do you want to leave behind on when it comes to your brand Cheekbone Beauty?
Yeah, I think the Indigenous community doesn't get enough recognition for being what I've said many times now, the OGs of sustainability. I think if you ask David Suzuki, he'll agree. And we just don't get enough recognition for the work that historically, thousands of years of evidence that when you actually pay attention to things like the soil, like there's so much message and teaching within all things in creation in itself, and human beings, because of greed, stopped paying attention to that. But we certainly hope that that people start to pay attention. And I think our communities have a lot to offer. And I feel like even in the beauty space, I've had to sit around and listen to a lot of presentations where people are talking about Indigenous people, but I haven't seen one Indigenous person talking about that. It's a lot of non-Indigenous people talking about how they support Indigenous communities and are buying raw ingredients from this. But these things are not Indigenous led. And I think Indigenous led is really important and makes a huge difference. But there's still time.
Well, and there's people like you that lead the way for people to see this. And so as we kind of get to the end of our time, I ask this question on it at the end of every episode. Is I'm a fan of the Lorax because it's just a funny story to read to my kids. And one would say that Dr. Seuss called climate change 50 something years ago when he wrote the book, and it's really just about overusing our resources. But the fact at the end is that this child catches a seed, and the idea being that, that one individual that plants that first seed or that does make that change is impactful. And so what would you say, either on a personal level or on a business side, how can people take that first step towards change for a better planet?
Just getting started, just doing it. And I love that concept of a seed, because maybe that seed, we've heard before, the person planting that may never get to enjoy the shade of that tree, right? But future generations certainly will. And so by someone just starting and making changes and doing the work, that it will benefit somebody.
Yeah, beautifully said. Jenn, thank you so much for joining me. How can people find out more about what you're doing, or to find out Cheekbone and your products, and how can they engage with your brand?
Yeah, so we are cheekbonebeauty.com, and you can find us in sephora.ca, and soon to be in 600 JCPenney locations in the US.
Well, we are looking forward to seeing your brand kind of everywhere, and obviously it represents, a really incredible change. And congratulations to you and your team for building what you're building. I know it's, talking through all this stuff. This is a lot harder than just simply building a cosmetic company against all the bigger ones. And so, congratulations and thanks so much for the time today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
All right, take care. This podcast is co-produced with The Brand is Female. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Someone Like You. And if you did, please share this. We're a new podcast, and I would love it if you could share it with a family member, friend, colleague, work colleague. Share it on Slack, whoever you do. Just share and spread the message of these incredible brands. Please also support these type of companies. They're doing the hard thing, and the hard thing often takes a lot of people to get on board. And don't forget, please subscribe on the platform of your choice and give us a rating and review. I'm Marco Pimentel. Thank you for joining us today. For more information on Someone Like You, you can find us on Instagram at Someone Like You Podcast, with all the links to the podcast, our website, and more information about the brands that we feature. Thank you again.